All of New Orleans called her the ugliest bride in the region, and the 300 people packed into the ballroom on Street Charles Avenue that night hadn't come to bless a wedding. They had come to watch the most powerful man in the city marry the girl everyone believed had burned her own mother to death. Delphine Rousseau, 26 years old, walked down the aisle in a dead woman's gown, the right side of her face a smooth sheet of grafted skin, her hair grown back on one side only, both hands sealed inside white cotton gloves she hadn't removed in front of another living soul in 8 years. At the far end of the aisle stood Salvatore Orsini, 33, a man who had taken everything from his enemies without ever once raising his voice. Then someone in the back rows said a single word, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Salvatore didn't turn his head. He simply reached out, drew the glove from her right hand, and in front of 300 people, lifted that scarred hand to his lips. The ballroom went silent. But the real shock of that night had nothing to do with the face or the hands the whole city had been talking about. It waited upstairs, in a room lit by a single lamp, at 3 a.m, when Salvatore passed a door left slightly open and saw his bride sitting on the floor with something in her hands. A man who had never in his life looked away from anything had to hold the doorframe to stay standing. And what she said to him that night, one sentence only, would leave anyone who heard it unable to hold back their tears. If you love stories about people the whole world judged wrongly, leave a like so we know you're here. Share this with someone you think needs to hear it tonight. And subscribe, so every evening we have a story to share together. Now, let's go back to that ballroom, back to the moment before the vows. The minister closed the book, and a small table covered in red velvet was brought forward, with the marriage register and a fountain pen already resting upon it. Delphine stepped forward and bent over the table, and the entire great hall seemed to lean with her. 300 heads waited to see how that hand would write. She placed the pen in her right hand first, exactly as an ordinary person would, and just as the nib touched the paper, footsteps left the row of honored guests. Beauregard Whitlock walked forward, slowly and unhurriedly, with the stride of a man accustomed to being watched. He was the chairman of Whitlock Merchants Bank. His name appeared on 4 bronze plaques throughout the city, and on paper, he was her father. He came up behind her, extended one hand, and placed it on her shoulder. Before 300 people, the gesture appeared to be that of a father guiding his daughter into a new life. Delphine didn't flinch. She stopped breathing. For 2 seconds, her chest became perfectly still. Her shoulder didn't move, her eyes never left the paper, and the pen remained suspended precisely above the first letter. Then she transferred it to her left hand. She did it naturally and neatly, like someone who had performed the movement thousands of times, and she wrote her name with her left hand before the entire city. Whitlock lowered his head to inspect the writing, and kept his voice just loud enough for the front row to hear. The girl's handwriting used to be so beautiful. Quiet laughter spread through the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th rows, the kind of laughter people reserved for those they believed stood beneath them. Delphine completed the final stroke, set down the pen, and never looked up. Salvatore Orsini stood roughly 16 inches away. Not one feature of his face changed. He didn't turn toward Whitlock, look at the rows of laughing guests, or do anything that might reveal to anyone in the hall that he had just placed something inside the part of his mind from which nothing had ever escaped. He merely reached for the pen and signed his name beneath hers, his signature slow and even, without one hurried stroke. Whitlock gave his daughter's shoulder one final, gentle squeeze, then withdrew his hand, inclined his head toward the minister with flawless courtesy, and turned toward the guests with his smile still perfectly intact. Delphine exhaled. No one heard that breath except the man standing beside her. The music began again. Glasses were raised once more, and the newly married couple walked back down the aisle beneath gazes that held no goodwill. She walked straight, though no one knew what kept her upright. Salvatore matched her pace exactly, and didn't speak to her until the car door closed, and the city began receding beyond the glass. Inside the car, there was only the sound of the engine. Amos Thibodeau sat behind the wheel, 68 years old and 40 years in the Orsini household, and he asked no questions because he never had. Delphine sat unnaturally straight, without leaning against the seat, both hands resting on her knees, the white cotton glove from her right hand still lying in her left palm since Salvatore had removed it. Salvatore watched the road for a long while, then asked when she had begun writing with her left hand. She didn't answer. He didn't ask again. People said Salvatore Orsini never repeated a sentence twice, and that was true, though few knew the real reason. He never needed to repeat himself, because he never forgot. The car traveled 4 blocks. Then Delphine spoke, her voice dry and flat, as though she were reading a line from an official report. If you paid for a performance tonight, I believe you have seen enough. Salvatore replied that he hadn't paid a single dollar for that evening, that her father had covered every expense, and that if she wanted to know what he had given up, he would tell her, but not inside that car. She fell silent. Outside, St. Charles Avenue moved backward beneath the trees, and light from other people's windows passed rhythmically across her face. She opened her hand, looked at the white cotton glove resting in her palm, then closed her fingers around it without putting it back on. Salvatore noticed. He said nothing about it. He asked only one more question. The final question he spoke inside the car. Was there anything she needed in his house that he didn't yet know about? Delphine turned her head and looked at him for the first time since entering the car. She said she needed a desk, a lamp, and a door with a lock. He said she would have all three. 10 weeks before that night, no one in New Orleans believed Salvatore Orsini would marry anyone because Salvatore Orsini had another problem. The letter from Whitlock Merchants Bank arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was 3 pages long and written in language so courteous that it had to be read twice before its true meaning became clear. The refinancing loan for the Eastern Cargo Terminal was being recalled. All of it. Within 6 weeks, the writer described the decision as a routine portfolio adjustment and expressed the hope that their business relationship would continue in the future. Salvatore read the letter twice, folded it, and said nothing for 4 minutes. 400 dock workers earned their living at that terminal. 400 names appeared on the payroll, and behind each name was a home, rent, a child attending school, and a car payment. In 6 weeks, all of it would disappear, and what kept him silent the longest wasn't the figure. It was that he couldn't find a reason. The Eastern Cargo Terminal was profitable. Its books were clean. The loan had never been late by so much as one payment. No one recalled a loan from a client like that unless they wanted something else. The following morning, he went to the docks at 5 o'clock. It was still dark, mist was rising from the river, and the floodlights remained illuminated above the men waiting in line to receive their work assignments. He brought no one except Amos. He walked the entire length of the warehouses, spoke with 7 or 8 men, and asked ordinary questions about the shift, the cargo, and the forklift that kept jamming. Then he entered the weigh station, called the night manager outside, and spoke 3 sentences to him. First, he said he had read the weigh slips from the previous 11 weeks. Second, he said the difference between the figures on those slips and the inventory inside the warehouse was enough to purchase a boat, and he knew where that boat was docked. Third, he said the manager had until noon to leave the terminal, and his professional inspection license would be invalid before he reached home. No one touched him. No one raised a voice. The night manager stood there as the color drained from his face, then turned away to retrieve his coat. Rocco Orsini watched everything from beginning to end and couldn't tolerate it. He was 28 years old, and he told his older brother that their father would never have handled such a matter with 3 sentences, that the entire harbor would believe the Orsini family had grown weak, and that they needed to leave something behind for people to remember. Salvatore turned toward his younger brother and said the man would remember. What he had just lost was his profession, not one evening. 10 years from now, he still wouldn't be able to find work in that industry, and no one would have to wash his hands afterward. Rocco tried to continue, but Salvatore stopped him without anger, using only one sentence. If you want to do things the way Father did, then you must be able to live the life Father lived. Father died in a church parking lot. Do you remember? Rocco fell silent. On the journey home, the car followed the river, and no one spoke for a long time. Then Amos Thibodeau, who had sat behind the wheel for the Orsini family for 40 years and had driven Salvatore's father before driving Salvatore, began to speak. He didn't turn around. His eyes remained on the road as he said he knew what the young master was considering. He knew what the letter from the bank meant, and he knew Salvatore intended to solve the problem himself, alone, by any means necessary, without asking anyone for help. Then he spoke the words no one else in the Orsini household would have dared to say. 400 homes, sir. Don't think with your pride. Salvatore didn't answer. He looked through the window at the row of warehouses receding behind them, at the men lifting crates onto their shoulders in exchange for another day's living, and he knew the old man was right. All his life, he had been taught that the most costly thing a man in his world could lose was his standing, and preserving that standing meant never begging. But the letter wasn't aimed at his standing. It was aimed at 400 homes, and the people living inside those homes had done nothing to deserve paying the price for anyone's pride. He told Amos to keep driving, and added that the old man wasn't to say those words a second time. Amos replied that he wouldn't need to because he knew Salvatore had heard him. 3 days later, an invitation arrived. Beauregard Whitlock's name was printed on the envelope. The invitation gave a time and an address, with an additional handwritten line saying that it would be a pleasure if Mr. Orsini could spare him 10 minutes after the ceremony. The ceremony was the dedication of a new treatment wing at the charitable hospital, whose board Beauregard Whitlock chaired, and the wing bore his name. Salvatore arrived 15 minutes late, stood at the far end of the hallway, and watched a silk ribbon being cut before the cameras of 4 newspapers. 2 congressmen, an archbishop, and roughly 100 guests applauded. Whitlock spoke for 5 minutes without notes, his voice warm as he talked about the people who entered that hospital with nothing in their hands. Everyone listening believed him. That was the first appreciation Salvatore noted about the man. Whitlock wasn't performing. He had believed his own words for a very long time. Afterward, refreshments were arranged in the lobby, and Whitlock separated himself from the crowd exactly as promised, still holding his glass. He didn't lead Salvatore into a private room. He merely walked several paces with him toward a window roughly 30 feet from the guests, far enough that no one could hear them, and close enough that all 100 people could see the 2 men speaking. Salvatore understood the arrangement immediately. Whitlock didn't need a closed door there because he was the host, and a man carrying a loan recall notice in his pocket couldn't stand as an equal beside the man whose ribbon had just been cut. Whitlock began by asking after Salvatore's grandmother. He said he had heard about the flooding 2 years earlier and regretted not learning of it sooner so he could offer assistance. Then he said he deeply respected the way the Orsini family operated the Eastern Cargo Terminal, that its books were clean and its workers were paid on time, and that for precisely this reason, he had been sorry to see the loan file brought before the board. Salvatore asked who had brought it forward. Whitlock said matters like that didn't belong to one person. There was only a process. Then he added that, fortunately, every process contained a place where someone could sign a name. Salvatore didn't answer. He knew he had just heard the most important sentence of the evening, and he knew the price would follow immediately, because in his world, no one had ever opened with kindness without attaching a bill. Whitlock set his glass on the windowsill and stated what he wanted in the voice of a man discussing the transfer of a parcel of land. He said he had a daughter. She was 26 years old, unmarried, and her condition made marriage more difficult than usual. He used the exact word condition. He said he had cared for her for 8 years, had done everything a man in his position could do, and had reached the point where a permanent arrangement was required. He said the Orsini name was a stable one, and that a marriage would resolve both sides' problems at once. Then he delivered the remainder very concisely. The loan file would be removed from the board's agenda. The Eastern Cargo Terminal would receive new financing with a longer term than before, and the 400 people working there would never need to hear any news about it. During those 4 minutes, he never once used the word happiness. He didn't say whether his daughter wanted the marriage. He didn't speak her name. He discussed her as though she were a parcel of land that needed to be transferred before the end of the year, and Salvatore sat inside that truth without allowing his face to change, while noting that there was something in the way this father omitted his daughter's name that he couldn't yet put into words. He asked her name. Whitlock paused, very briefly, almost too briefly to notice, then said Delphine. Salvatore asked what she did. Whitlock said she performed craft work in Bywater, speaking the word craft the way people spoke about a habit that ought to be understood and forgiven. Salvatore allowed the silence to continue exactly beyond the point of comfort, then said he would give Whitlock an answer, but he had one condition. Whitlock invited him to name it. Salvatore said he would meet her first, alone, with no one else in the room, and no one informed of the meeting in advance. Whitlock smiled, the smile of a man being asked to follow an unnecessary procedure, and said that if it gave Salvatore peace of mind, he saw no problem. Then he lifted his glass and turned back toward the guests. The workshop in Bywater stood at the end of an alley, with a wooden door and a faded hand-painted sign, and Salvatore arrived alone at 4 o'clock the following afternoon. The front room was empty. In the room beyond it, a long table stood beneath a lamp pulled low, and a woman sat there with both hands covered in white cotton gloves. She didn't rise. She didn't look up. Before her were 2 sheets of paper fused into one, and she was sliding a thin bone folder between them, very slowly, while her left hand held a thread stretched taut. He remained in the doorway for 10 seconds. She spoke first. "You are blocking the light by standing there." He stepped aside. "You know who I am. I have known who you are since my father called. You came sooner than I expected." "He already told you?" "He didn't tell me. He informed me." She moved the bone folder forward by the width of half a grain of rice, stopped, waited, then moved it again. Salvatore watched her hands work and said nothing until she withdrew the tool. "Do you intend to let me sit down? The chair is behind you. I can't stand up in the middle of this. The 2 pages are open, and if I remove my hands, they will adhere again." "How long?" I have been working on them for 3 weeks. I need roughly one more. He sat down. She still didn't look up, and she began saying what she had decided to say from the moment she heard the news, because 8 years had taught her that speaking the words herself always hurt less than sitting and waiting for someone else to speak them. I will save you time. 8 years ago, there was a fire in the Historical Society archives. My mother worked there. She didn't get out. I did. The report said I spilled a solvent. The court convicted me of manslaughter. I spent 5 years in prison and was released 3 years ago. This entire city calls me the girl who burned her mother to death, and according to the verdict, they are correct. Have you read everything? I read the verdict. Then you have read all of me. I read the verdict. I haven't read you. Her hand stopped. It was the first time they had stopped during the entire meeting. Do you expect me to thank you for saying that? No. Good. Because I have nothing to thank you for. Listen to me, Mr. Orsini. I know what I am in this arrangement. My father needs to dispose of an asset, and you need something from him. I am not asking what you need. Marry me if you wish. I won't object. I ask only one thing of you. Say it. Don't pretend. Don't tell me you see something in me that no one else has seen for 8 years. I have heard that sentence 3 times. Twice from reporters and once from a minister. And all 3 times, they wanted something from me. I didn't come to take anything from you. Then why did you come? To ask one question. Ask it. He didn't ask immediately. He looked at the table, the glass jars arranged in rows, the small brushes, the thin sheets of tissue paper. And he studied them for a long time, like a man counting. The report names a solvent, the kind they claimed you spilled that night. Yes. Did you ever use it? She was silent. A truck passed outside the front room. Then the sound disappeared, leaving only the faint hum of the lamp. She remained still for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. And during that silence, something began breaking very slowly across her face before she could conceal it. Never. Not once? Not once in my life. It is used for oil paint. I work with paper. She placed the bone folder on the table, and her fingers trembled slightly as she released it. That room contained only paper and leather. There wasn't a single square foot of painted canvas. I had no reason to open a container of that solvent. I didn't keep it in my workshop. I never purchased it. I said this at the police station. I said it during the original trial. I said it during the appeal. My attorney told me that explaining technical details to a jury would only make me seem cold. And he was right, because they found me guilty within 4 hours. Did anyone else ever ask you that question? During those 8 years? She looked up for the first time. You are the first. Salvatore said nothing. He merely remained seated. And inside his mind, the courteous 3-page letter, recalling the loan, shifted very slightly into another place. Don't do that, she said. Do what? Don't begin believing me. Everyone who believes me eventually decides they were deceived. Then they return angry with me for it. And I no longer have the strength to endure anyone else's anger. He rose and spoke the only promise he knew he could keep. I won't lie to you. Not once. Then he walked toward the door. When he reached the threshold, she called after him. Mr. Orsini, what is at the Eastern Cargo Terminal? He stopped. 400 people. She picked up the bone folder. Then marry me. The Orsini family ate dinner at 7 o'clock. And in 40 years, no one had been permitted to arrive later than 7:10. That evening, Salvatore waited until Odette LeBlanc cleared the second plate before speaking the name. He said the chairman of Whitlock Merchants Bank had made a proposal involving the Eastern Cargo Terminal and a marriage, and that the woman Whitlock wanted him to marry was his daughter, Delphine Rousseau. Rocco set down his knife so hard that the glass trembled. Rousseau, that Rousseau girl from the archives. Yes. Do you know what people say about her? I know what people say. I also know what the court said. Then you know enough. Rocco pushed back his chair. You intend to attach the Orsini name to a woman like that? Do you know what the entire city will be saying over dinner 3 months from now? Father has been dead only 4 years, and you intend to trade his name for a loan? At the head of the table, Perpetua Orsini set down her spoon. She was 79 years old, and no one in that house continued speaking when she put down her spoon. Rocco, sit down. He sat. She didn't look at him. She looked into her palms resting on the tablecloth. 2 years ago, floodwater entered the lower floor. Do you remember your grandfather's box of letters? The box containing the 31 letters he wrote to me during the 2 years he was away in the service? They had fused into one solid block, as hard as a piece of wood. I took it to 4 places in this city. 3 told me to throw it away. 1 told me to keep it as a remembrance, and never attempt to open it again. The 5th place was in Bywater. A girl wearing white gloves accepted the work, kept it for 2 months, and returned 29 readable letters to me. She charged $40. I offered her more, and she refused it. Perpetua was silent for a moment. I was able to hear my husband's voice again. At my age, there aren't many things like that left. Rocco spoke more quietly, though he still refused to yield. Grandmother, she was convicted. I am not speaking about the verdict. I am speaking about those 2 hands. I sat before those hands for 2 months, and I know what they were made to do. The papers may say whatever they please. The Orsini name, Perpetua interrupted, has been attached to far worse things, and none of them were because of that girl. No one in the room spoke. Odette stood in the kitchen doorway holding a tray and didn't enter. Salvatore remained silent, thinking about those 2 hands guiding the bone folder between 2 pages by the width of half a grain of rice at a time. 3 weeks for a single sheet. He thought about the final words Delphine had spoken to him at the threshold. He told his grandmother he would marry her. Perpetua replied that she hadn't asked whether he would marry. She wanted him to remember one thing. The girl wasn't alone, and if he treated her like one, Perpetua would never forgive him. Rocco rose, said he wouldn't attend the wedding, and left. Afterward, Salvatore went upstairs to the study and called Harland Voss. Voss was the family attorney, 54 years old, a man who had served Salvatore's father since 11 years before Salvatore held any authority, and Salvatore had never needed to tell him anything twice. He said he needed a prenuptial agreement and asked how soon it could be completed. Voss arrived 40 minutes later. He placed his leather briefcase on the desk, opened it, and withdrew a thick set of papers, which he laid before Salvatore. I have already prepared the framework. You need only give me the name and date, and I can complete it within 20 minutes. Salvatore looked at the papers. They were roughly 30 pages thick, typed, with creases at the corners like something that had been removed and returned many times. When did you prepare this? When you received the letter from the bank. Voss clicked the cap of his pen. Under circumstances like these, a document would eventually become necessary. I prepared it in advance to avoid wasting your time. Salvatore said nothing. He picked up the papers, felt that they weighed exactly what they ought to weigh, and set them down again. Good, he said. Then he gave Voss the name and date. He asked no questions because in 11 years, Harland Voss had never given him reason to ask one, and because that evening, Salvatore's mind held only 400 homes, and a thin bone folder resting on a table beneath a low lamp in Bywater. The car reached the house at 11 o'clock, and Odette LeBlanc was waiting in the entrance hall as she had waited for 40 years. She watched the woman who had just entered, saw how Delphine placed one hand on the staircase railing, and paused for one beat before climbing the first step, and knew immediately that something was wrong. By the 6th step, she saw it. Across the ivory silk at the back of the dress, directly beneath the horizontal seam of the bodice, was a dark stain that spread very slowly with each step Delphine took. Miss Delphine, I know. She didn't turn around. I have known since we were in the hall. Odette called the master's name once, only once, and Salvatore was already at the foot of the stairs. He didn't climb them. He remained where he was. What do you need? I don't need anything. The bodice is tight, and there are several places where the skin has only recently closed, so they have opened again. It happens. I can manage it myself. Do you have medical supplies? I have been doing this myself for 8 years. She climbed 2 more steps, and on the 3rd, her knees weakened. She didn't fall. She merely sat down neatly on the stair, like someone accustomed to knowing exactly when her body would no longer hold her upright. Odette supported her beneath one arm, and this time, Delphine didn't push her away. Salvatore climbed to the doorway of the eastern bedroom and stopped precisely at the threshold. Odette guided Delphine inside and closed the door halfway. Salvatore turned toward the hallway and stood facing the wall. He remained there for 20 minutes. No sound came from the room. Not one cry. Not one broken breath. Only water moving in a basin and scissors cutting bandages. And it was that silence that made his hands close into fists. Odette worked slowly and said nothing. When the ivory silk slipped down beneath the lamp, she had served in that house for 40 years and had witnessed many things, but she still had to straighten herself for one beat. What she saw wasn't a wound. It was a map. Grafted skin extended from Delphine's right shoulder across the whole of her back. Old stitches faded to ivory white, smooth regions without pores, and within that map were 3 small places where the edge of the bodice had rubbed the skin open. All of it belonged to 8 years earlier. It had healed, grown old, and become part of the body she would have to carry for the rest of her life. Delphine sat with her back straight throughout those 20 minutes. She stared at the wall before her with dry eyes and spoke only one sentence, telling Odette not to use bandages with adhesive along the edges, because grafted skin couldn't tolerate adhesive. Then Odette came out, closed the door, and told Salvatore it was finished. He didn't ask what she had seen. He didn't enter the room. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Salvatore walked along the second-floor hallway because he couldn't sleep that night, and he saw that the eastern bedroom door was partly open, with a single lamp still burning inside. He looked in. Delphine sat on the floor at the foot of the bed, wrapped in a shawl, both hands bare. Before her, resting on a white cloth, lay a small blackened object, shrunken and curled at the corners, resembling a piece of charcoal pulled from a furnace. She held flat-tipped tweezers in her right hand and was guiding them between two layers of the object, moving even more slowly than she had while separating the pages in Bywater. Salvatore didn't understand immediately. He had to stand there for 10 seconds before he recognized the object. It was a notebook. He gripped the doorframe. The man who had never turned his face from anything in his life had to hold the doorframe to remain upright. He made no sound, but she knew he was there. She didn't turn around. "My mother's notebook," she said. "I pulled it out that night. It was the only thing I managed to save." The tweezers moved by the smallest distance. "People say I burned my mother to death. For 8 years, I have sat here every night, separating one layer at a time, only to hear what my mother wanted to say to me." He asked how much she had managed to separate. 11 pages, she said, "in 8 years." Salvatore remained at the threshold for a long time. Then he went downstairs, opened a cabinet in the study, took out a key, returned upstairs, and placed it on the floor at the threshold, close enough for her to reach without requiring him to enter the room. He said the lock on that door was on the inside, that only one key existed, and that it now belonged to her. She had the right to use it against anyone in the house, including him. He said the western room downstairs had 4 windows facing north and would become her workshop beginning the following day. She could arrange it however she wished, and no one would enter without her permission. Then he spoke the only promise he knew he could keep. He wouldn't promise to love her because making such a promise now would be a lie. He would promise only one thing. He would never lie to her, no matter how difficult the truth might be to hear. She remained silent for a long time. Then, without turning around, she said, "Go to sleep, Mr. Orsini. It is 3 o'clock in the morning." He left. Behind him, the lock didn't turn. On Monday morning, Delphine walked along the eastern hallway and stopped. 4 places on the wall were lighter than the surrounding paint. 4 rectangles with a nail still remaining at each corner. She studied them, then went downstairs to the kitchen to find Odette. "Where are the mirrors from the eastern hallway?" Odette was folding linens and didn't turn immediately. "I put them in storage." "Who told you to do that?" "No one told me." "Then please hang them again." "All 4. Odette set down the linen. "Miss Delphine, you heard me. All 4, in their original places." Odette studied her for a moment, and during 40 years in that house, she had learned when to stop. That afternoon, all 4 mirrors were returned to their former places. Delphine passed through that hallway 4 or 5 times each day, and she never hurried past them. She didn't stop to look at herself, nor did she avoid them. She merely passed them as someone might pass a window. Odette told Perpetua about it at dinner, and after listening to everything, the old woman said only that the girl didn't need anyone shielding her. She needed people to stop shielding her. The western room was cleared within 3 days. Delphine placed a long table beneath the 4 north-facing windows, brought 2 crates of tools from Bywater, and by the 4th day, she was working there from 8 o'clock in the morning until 7 at night. Rocco Orsini didn't enter that room. He also refused to eat at the table when she was present, and when they were forced to pass each other in the hall, he acknowledged her with exactly one inclination of his head. Then something happened during the 2nd week. In a cabinet inside their father's study, on the lowest shelf, was a black, leather-bound book. It was his sea log, 30 years of pencil entries recording journeys into the Gulf, names of ships, names of men, and the weather. On the final pages were several lines he had written for his 2 sons, but had never given to anyone. 11 years earlier, seawater had soaked the book and fused it into a solid block. Rocco had taken it to 2 places, and both said nothing could be done. It had remained inside that cabinet ever since. That afternoon, he went downstairs to retrieve a file and found the cabinet open and the book gone. He walked directly to the western room, pushed open the door, and prepared to speak the sentence he had rehearsed for 2 weeks. He couldn't say it. The logbook lay open in the center of the table. 7 pages had already been separated and were being held flat between sheets of glass. On the 3rd sheet was their father's pencil writing, faded but legible, recording the name of a ship and a date during the summer when Rocco was 4 years old. Delphine didn't look up. "I took it without permission. If you don't want me to work on it, I will return it exactly as it was. I haven't cut anything." Rocco remained where he was. "Can it be read?" "Yes, 37 pages." It will take roughly 5 more weeks." He said nothing else. He left the room, and that evening, he sat at the dining table even though she was present. He still didn't speak to her, but he sat. On Friday morning of that week, Delphine returned to Bywater to collect the remaining bottles of solution she had left behind. She opened the workshop door and knew immediately that someone had entered. Not because anything was missing. Nothing had been taken. The lock remained intact. The door frame bore no scratches. The hinges hadn't shifted. And on the concrete floor directly inside the threshold, a curved trail of dust had been swept away, the mark left when the door opened inward and closed again. She studied that mark for more than 1 minute. Someone forcing a door left evidence on the frame. Someone with a key left only a curve in the dust. On the long table, her 3 bottles of solution remained arranged in their original order, but the label on the middle bottle faced outward. Delphine had never positioned a label outward in all her years of work, because she arranged her materials according to her hands, not her eyes. She didn't call the police. When she returned home that evening, she told Salvatore exactly 3 things. Someone had entered her workshop. That person possessed a key. And in 8 years, she had given a key to only one person, her mother, who had been dead for 8 years. Salvatore listened to everything. He didn't ask her to repeat a single sentence. He asked only who owned the workshop, and Delphine told him he could discover for himself which bank held the lease. Salvatore didn't ask her a single question. He had made that promise at the threshold at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he kept it. Everything he did afterward was done downstairs behind another door, without leaving so much as a sound she would have to hear. The first matter was the report. The investigative file concerning the cause of a fire 8 years earlier wasn't something stored in a safe. It rested in the fire department archives among several thousand other files, and with enough time and the right person, it became nothing more than a 32-page copy placed on Salvatore's desk one Thursday afternoon. He read it 3 times. The first time, he read it as someone might read old tragic news. The second time, he read slowly, stopping at every section. And he saw nothing because the report had been written very well. The sentences were concise. The timeline was clear. The diagram of the scene was drawn by hand but cleanly rendered, properly scaled, with every room numbered. The conclusion appeared on page 27, 3 paragraphs without a single sign of uncertainty. It stated that the fire had originated in the western room, that a quantity of solvent had spilled across the wooden floor and encountered a heat source, that the person present in the room that evening was Delphine Rousseau, 18 years old, and that there was no evidence of a third party. By the third reading, Salvatore had something else on his desk, and that was why he read it a 3rd time. He had sent someone to Bywater to obtain the supply statements from Delphine's workshop for the previous 3 years, along with a list of consumable materials used by a paper conservator. The statement was 4 pages long. He placed it beside the report and searched for the solvent named on page 27. It wasn't there. It hadn't appeared once in 3 years. He called an acquaintance at the art school, mentioned no names, and merely read the name of the solvent aloud before asking what it was used for. The other man answered immediately, without needing to think. It was used with oil paintings to clean brushes and thin paint. He even asked whether Salvatore wanted to know where it could be purchased. Salvatore then asked whether paper conservators ever used it. The man laughed and said no. Bringing that substance near an old sheet of paper would destroy it, and no one in the profession would keep it inside a workshop. Salvatore put down the telephone and sat motionless. He returned to page 6, where the scene diagram appeared, and read the inventory describing the contents of each room. The western room, where the fire originated, contained paper records, maps, registers, leather-bound documents, and a cabinet of conservation tools. There wasn't a single square foot of painted canvas. There wasn't a single picture frame. Nothing in that room provided any reason for a container of solvent intended for oil painting to be there. And during the previous 3 years, the woman accused of spilling it hadn't purchased it once. He remembered that afternoon in Bywater, and the way she had spoken the words, "It is used for oil paint. I work with paper." He remembered how her fingers trembled when she placed the bone folder on the table. 8 years, and she had been the only person to say it aloud, while everyone else decided that speaking in professional terms made her appear cold to the jury. Salvatore didn't continue farther into the report. He hadn't yet studied the remaining pages closely, compared the file numbers, or counted the pages, because he needed only one place to begin, and he had found it. He turned to the final page containing the signatures. The fire investigator responsible for the case had signed in blue ink, his handwriting large and clear like that of a man with nothing to conceal. "DeWitt Parrish." Salvatore gave the name to one of his men that evening, without explaining why. 4 days later, They returned with a single sheet of paper. Dewitt Parrish, 61 years old, had left the fire department 6 years earlier and was receiving a government pension. His current address was a lakeside house to the north with a private wooden dock, and the recorded purchase price was an amount no one living on a government pension could have afforded in 30 years. No inheritance had been recorded. There had been no lottery winnings. Salvatore read the page twice, folded it, and placed it inside a locked drawer. Upstairs, in the western room, the lamp was still burning, and the faint sound of tweezers being placed on glass traveled into the hallway. 4 days later, at 8 o'clock on Wednesday morning, 3 police cars were parked outside the alley in Bywater. The City Historical Society had reported the theft of a map of the lower Mississippi River Basin drawn in 1783, one of only 4 surviving copies in the world, and the report included a line suggesting the involvement of someone previously convicted in connection with the Society's archives. The map was found inside Delphine's workshop on the long table, held between 2 sheets of cardboard and covered with a thin piece of tissue paper. By the time she arrived, the police had been there for half an hour. Salvatore accompanied her and didn't say one word during the journey. Only when they reached the threshold did he tell the nearest plainclothes officer that his wife would answer every question and that he would remain outside. The person who motioned for him to step back was a 41-year-old inspector with hair cut to her shoulders and no notebook in her hands. Delphine saw her and paused for one beat at the threshold. Inspector Hathaway. Miss Rousseau. Neither woman said anything more about what had happened 8 years earlier. June Hathaway pointed toward the table. Do you have anything to say about this? Yes, but I need you to stand beside me and look, not merely listen to what I say. If you only listen, you won't believe me. I already know that. Hathaway approached the table. Delphine didn't touch the map. She put on her gloves, stood 1 handspan from the table, and began pointing. First, the tissue paper covering it. This is fully desulfurized tissue manufactured after 2000. I purchase it from only one supplier in the city, and that supplier has invoices. If this map had been stored in the Society's archives for 8 years, it would have been lined with the paper the Society has used since the 1980s, the kind with lengthwise grain and edges that yellow over time. Open any archive box in that building, and you will find it. Someone rewrapped this map using my materials within the past 3 days. Hathaway said nothing. Second, Delphine pointed toward 2 pieces of tape at the corners of the cardboard. Press your finger against the edge of this tape. Don't peel it away, only press it. It is still soft and adhesive. When this kind of tape remains in my workshop for more than 2 weeks, the edge hardens and collects dust. This has been here for less than 3 days. Hathaway pressed it. She didn't say what she felt, but she withdrew her hand more slowly than she had extended it. Third, and this is the most important, Delphine pointed to the tabletop beside the cardboard. I haven't cleaned this table in 22 days because I moved all my equipment to the house and returned only to collect the remaining bottles of solution. Look at the dust. Do you see this boundary? Where the dust has been compressed into a rectangle around the cardboard? Dust, accumulating for 22 days, forms one continuous, even layer. If this map had been here 3 weeks ago, the boundary would be blurred and newly settled dust would cover it. Shine a light across the surface. This boundary is sharp. The map was placed here recently. She stepped backward. I don't need you to believe me. I need you to photograph this table before anyone touches it and record in your report that I was the person who requested the photograph. Hathaway signaled to the others. They took the photographs. She stood looking at the boundary in the dust for a long time, then asked a question unrelated to the map. She spoke very quietly, almost so only the 2 women could hear. 8 years ago, did you tell me about the solvent? Delphine didn't turn her head. Yes. Where? In the second interview room at the police station that night. At roughly 4 o'clock in the morning. I told you it was used for oil paint, that I worked with paper, and that I had never purchased it. You sat on my right and wrote in a blue-covered notebook. You asked me twice so you could record the name correctly. Hathaway stood motionless. You entered it into your report, Delphine said. That report isn't in the case file. I requested it 3 times during my appeal. I was told there was no report containing that information. A long silence filled the workshop. Then Hathaway asked who besides Delphine possessed a key to the door. Delphine said no one. She said that 1 week earlier, someone had unlocked the door without damaging anything, that a curved trail in the dust remained beside the threshold, and she hadn't erased it, and she invited Hathaway to examine it. At noon, the workshop was sealed, and no one was arrested. On the journey home, Salvatore asked who within the Historical Society could enter the archives without signing the register. Delphine looked through the window. The society has a board of 9 trustees. My father has served on it for 14 years. The bronze plaque in the entrance hall is the 5th plaque bearing his name in this city. Salvatore didn't give the matter to Harlan Voss. He never explained the reason to himself. He simply called another attorney, a man in Baton Rouge who had never worked for the family and knew no one in the city, and paid him to read Josephine Rousseau's original trust, rather than the 4 pages inserted into the marriage agreement. 3 days later, the attorney called back, and the first thing he asked was whether Salvatore was sitting or standing. The trust was 19 pages long, and its most important provision didn't concern who received the assets. It appeared on page 14, in the section governing the transfer process. Before the assets could be delivered to the beneficiary on the day she turned 27, the trustee was required to submit all 8 years of financial records to an independent auditing firm chosen by the beneficiary herself, and the auditor's final report had to be filed with the court. Josephine Rousseau had written that provision into her trust before she died. The Baton Rouge attorney said he had read several hundred family trusts during his career, and this wasn't language taken from a standard form. Whoever wrote it had been thinking about a specific person. Then he explained the second part, the part he had spent 2 days tracing through the minimum annual disclosures the trustee was legally required to publish. For 8 years, the assets had been reported as growing steadily at a rate so perfect that it appeared unnatural. But most of their value had gradually been converted into shares in 4 privately held companies that weren't publicly traded. All 4 had been created during those 8 years, and all 4 were registered at the same address, a building owned by Whitlock Merchants Bank. The attorney said he couldn't draw a final conclusion without seeing the internal books. Then he added that if he were the trustee, he wouldn't want an independent audit to occur at any point in his life. Salvatore put down the telephone and remained motionless in the study for a long time. He had misunderstood one thing from the beginning. He had believed Whitlock needed Delphine dead to obtain the money. That wasn't it. Whitlock had possessed the money for 8 years. He had spent it and blended it into his 4 companies. What he needed wasn't an inheritance. He needed Delphine never to reach November 11th, because on that date, a team of auditors selected by Delphine herself would enter, open 8 years of financial records before the court, and there was no way in the world to prevent it except for the beneficiary no longer to be there. Salvatore thought about Whitlock sitting atop that clock for 8 years, while Delphine spent 5 of those years in prison and then emerged to repair paper, knowing nothing. Then he thought about his own situation. He summoned his men and instructed them to determine the exact date on which the Eastern Cargo Terminal loan had been brought before the bank's board. They needed 1 week. What they returned with was a page containing 3 short entries. The file was placed on the review list on June 22nd. The recall resolution was approved on June 29th. The 3-page letter to Salvatore was sent on July 1st. Attached to the final entry was the sentence he read 3 times. The request to place the loan file under review hadn't come from the credit department. It had come from the chairman's office. He set the page on the desk and sat there as something very cold moved along his spine, because the final calculation had appeared, and it was perfectly clean. 3 weeks. Exactly 3 weeks between the day the chairman's office proposed, tightening its hands around the throat of the Eastern Cargo Terminal, and the day the envelope bearing Beauregard Whitlock's name arrived at Salvatore's house. Salvatore Orsini had spent his entire life believing he was the man who arranged the table. He selected the people, the time, and the price, and no one could place a piece into his hand that he hadn't already seen. Now he sat inside his father's study and understood that the letter, which had silenced him for 4 minutes on that Tuesday morning, hadn't been a catastrophe that suddenly descended upon him. It had been a needle placed in exactly the right position, at exactly the right moment, by someone who had calculated in advance that a man holding 400 homes in his hands would agree to marry anyone. Salvatore hadn't been given a choice. He had been selected. 4 minutes passed before he rose, and the first thing he did was unlock the drawer, remove the page concerning DeWitt Parish, and place it beside the page that had just arrived. All 4 private companies named in the trust were registered in the same building, and Salvatore instructed his people to obtain the incorporation records for each one. He didn't search for Whitlock's name because he knew it wouldn't be there. He searched for the signature at the end, where the legal representative responsible for filing the documents was identified. In all 4 sets of records, the entry wasn't a person's name, but the name of a legal consulting company, Meredith Bay. He ordered an investigation into Meredith Bay. It was a subsidiary established 19 years earlier, active for exactly 7 years before ceasing operations. And during those 7 years, it had only 1 client. 3 names appeared on its list of partners. The second was Harlan Voss. Salvatore read that line and did nothing for 2 days. He called no one, changed no locks, said nothing to Delphine, and still allowed Voss to come to the house on Thursday afternoon as he had done for 11 years. Salvatore had learned from his father that a name in a file wasn't the truth. It was merely a place to begin, and a man who reached his conclusion at the beginning would die there. So he searched for the rest. Voss's file in the Orsini household stated that he had begun working for the family 11 years earlier. In the section describing his previous experience, the years before that were reduced to a single line, stating that he had practiced independently as a corporate consultant. No clients were named. Salvatore's father had hired him when Salvatore was 25, before Salvatore controlled anything, and before he was permitted to enter the room when the older men discussed business. Voss had arrived with 2 excellent recommendations and a clean record. During the next 11 years, he had never made a mistake that gave anyone reason to ask questions. That was why Salvatore had never suspected him. People didn't question the furnishings they inherited from their fathers. On the 3rd day, Salvatore's men brought him the final piece. Meredith Bay's 7 years of operation corresponded exactly with the 7 years during which every internal record at Whitlock Merchants Bank referred to an outside legal consulting firm. That firm ceased operations in March, exactly 5 months before Harland Voss entered the Orsini household. Then there was one more line, the line that made Salvatore place his hand flat against the desk. The dissolution filing for Meredith Bay recorded one final payment, a single amount outside its annual service agreement, classified as private work. The payment had been received on September 19th, 8 years earlier. The fire in the archives occurred on September 12th. Salvatore remained alone in his father's study until after 11 o'clock that night. He didn't become angry. What came over him wasn't anger. It was a perfectly flat sensation, like discovering that he had spent 11 years walking across a bridge with nothing beneath it. Then he did 2 things. First, on Friday morning, he summoned Harland Voss and said he needed documents prepared to transfer every record connected to his wife's case to the workshop in Bywater, because too many people entered and left the house, and he wanted the records kept somewhere only he and Delphine possessed keys. He said the transfer would take place the following Tuesday. No such documents existed. Voss recorded the instruction in his notebook, nodded, and said it was a sensible arrangement. The second task was more difficult. Salvatore summoned Rocco, closed the door, and told him about the 3 lines in the Meredith Bay records. Rocco listened to everything and rose before Salvatore finished the final sentence. 11 years. That old man has eaten at our table for 11 years. Sit down. Do you know what he signed for them 8 years ago? Not yet. I know only that he received payment on the 7th day after my mother-in-law died. Rocco took 2 steps toward the door, and Salvatore spoke his name once without raising his voice. Rocco stopped. Listen to me. If you leave this room with that expression on your face, he will know within 3 days, and within 4, everything we need will be burned. I don't need you to strike anyone. I need you to sit at dinner with him next Thursday, pour his water, call him Mr. Voss, and discuss the weather. Rocco turned back, his face red. You expect me to do that? You are good at many things. You have never been good at this. Salvatore rose and spoke his final sentence very slowly. Just once. Do it for me. Rocco remained there for a long time. Then he said he would, walked out, and closed the door very gently, with the care of a man struggling to control both hands. Salvatore told Voss that the files would be transferred to Bywater on Tuesday. Then on Thursday afternoon, in the middle of discussing another matter, he added very casually that, before the transfer, he would have everything collected on Saturday night and placed in the records room inside the refrigerated warehouse at the Eastern Cargo Terminal. There were no files in that room. It contained cargo ledgers, payroll records, and 3 empty metal cabinets. On Saturday night, Salvatore ordered everyone on duty away from that section except 4 men, and those 4 waited inside 2 dark rooms, roughly 20 yards from the records room. Rocco sat on a wooden crate for 4 hours without speaking once. At 11:40, a small truck entered the gate using an access card belonging to an ice supplier, parked in the corner of the yard, and 3 men continued on foot. They didn't force the door. The first man unlocked the records room with a key, exactly as someone had unlocked the Bywater workshop with a key, and they entered carrying 2 empty cloth bags. The lights came on. Rocco blocked the doorway, while the other 3 Orsini men sealed both ends of the hallway. One intruder tried to run toward the side exit and was restrained before taking 4 steps. The second reached inside his coat, and Rocco spoke 2 words. Do not. The man stopped reaching. The entire incident lasted roughly 20 seconds. By the time Salvatore entered, all 3 men were seated on the floor with their hands resting on their knees, and no one had touched them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask their names, who had hired them. or what they had entered the room to find, because he had known all three answers before leaving the house. He merely studied the undamaged lock on the open door, then looked at the man holding the ring of keys, and spoke one sentence. "Go back and tell him I don't sell my wife." Then he turned away. At the threshold, he instructed Rocco to release them through the main gate, have someone accompany them all the way to the road, and ensure that not one of them bore a mark. Rocco looked at his older brother without understanding, and asked why they were being released. Salvatore said the three men sitting on the floor knew nothing. They had been paid to open a door. If one of them failed to return home that night, by morning, the entire city would have a new story about the Orsini boss and his wife. That was the story Whitlock wanted more than anything now. Then Salvatore spoke one final sentence before walking into the yard. "You have done better tonight than you did all week. Don't ruin it in the final minute." Rocco remained there, and he released the men through the main gate. What Salvatore obtained that night wasn't three men. It was the telephone that fell from the keyholder's coat pocket when he sat down. A telephone he didn't dare request back. It was a prepaid device purchased from a grocery store, registered in no one's name, and it contained only 4 numbers. Salvatore's men needed 4 days to trace them. The first 3 belonged to members of the group. The 4th wasn't the number of a person. It belonged to the switchboard of an office building on Poydras Street. The 11th floor contained 7 offices, and one of those 7 was Harland Voss's law office. During the 7 days before the incident at the terminal, the prepaid phone had called that switchboard 3 times. The first call came on Friday afternoon, 8 minutes after Salvatore told Voss about transferring the files to Bywater. The second came on Thursday evening. The third came on Saturday morning at 9:12. Salvatore sat before those 3 lines for a long time. He knew they proved nothing in any court. Anyone could call an office building switchboard, and a man as cautious as Harland Voss would never allow a call to connect directly to his private telephone. But Salvatore didn't need to prove anything yet. He needed only to know. He placed the page in the locked drawer beside the report concerning DeWitt Parish and the page concerning June 22nd, and he thought about how one of those calls had been placed 8 minutes after he spoke an untrue sentence inside his father's study. Then he turned off the light. On his way upstairs, he passed the 2nd floor hallway and saw a line of light beneath the door of the western room, because every night, Delphine worked until her fingers could no longer hold the tweezers. Police removed the seal from the Bywater workshop on Monday, and that evening Salvatore had something real moved there. Not the false files he had mentioned to Voss, but the original investigation record from the fire 8 years earlier, 32 certified pages, along with 3 years of supply records from the workshop, 7 pages of reports on DeWitt Parish, and the 19-page trust document whose every page had been stamped by the lawyer in Baton Rouge. He moved everything there because Delphine wanted it there. She said that if she needed to read something, she needed to read it where she had her own table, her own lamp, and her own magnifying glass, and she said she had spent 5 years in prison because other people had done her reading for her. He had 2 new locks installed, and he stationed 2 men in a car at the mouth of the alley. By Friday, she had read everything once, and marked more than 40 passages in pencil. At midnight between Friday and Saturday, one of the 2 men in the car called the house. He said he could smell something burning at the end of the alley. Salvatore and Delphine arrived 14 minutes later. Smoke had already reached the door, dense and low, and the fire was in the back room. His men were pulling a hose from a hydrant about 40 yards away. Delphine didn't stop to listen to anyone. She went straight to the sink outside the door, turned on the water, plunged her shawl beneath it, wrung it once, folded it into quarters, and pressed it over her nose and mouth. Then she took off her shoes. Salvatore caught her arm. "You're not going in." 32 certified pages. The original trust document, stamped on every page. "Can you buy those again?" "I can get them again." "No, you can get copies. People will ask why a second set appeared after the first one burned, and that question will kill us in court." She pulled free of his hand. "The second safe from the left, against the north wall. I know the north wall is the thickest wall in this building because I rented it for 10 years. Then she dropped to the floor and crawled. She crawled instead of running, keeping close to the floor and following the wall on her right, one hand sweeping the ground ahead of her. Salvatore went in 3 seconds after her. He said nothing more because no one could hear anything in there. The smoke had gathered overhead in a solid layer, and beneath it there were barely 8 inches of air. She stayed inside those 8 inches the entire way. When they reached the safe, its door was hot and jammed because the frame had swollen. She struck the upper right edge twice to show him where, and Salvatore drove his shoulder into it. The door opened on the 3rd blow. She reached in with both hands, pulled out one bundle, pinned it between her arm and her body, then reached in again for the rest. He dragged her out through the side door. They made it. Water sprayed through the doorway while the two of them sat on the concrete at the mouth of the alley, and Delphine still held the bundle of papers clamped between her arm and her body. The first thing she said when she could breathe again was to ask whether everything was there. Salvatore counted. Everything was there. 32 pages, 19 pages, the supply records, 7 pages. Not one sheet was missing. She nodded once, and only then did she allow someone to draw her hands out of her lap. At the hospital, they bandaged both hands halfway to her elbows and told her 3 weeks, perhaps 4. Perpetua Orsini arrived close to 3 in the morning, without changing her clothes, her hair still tied back in a sleeping scarf. She sat beside the bed and took those bandaged hands in her own, very gently, the way one holds something that must never be allowed to fall. For 20 minutes, she didn't say a word. Neither did Delphine. She lay staring at the ceiling, calculating something else, and only when the old woman asked what she was thinking did she say it aloud. She said 3 weeks meant 3 weeks when she couldn't hold the tweezers. She said that every night she managed to separate a space no wider than half a grain of rice, and that it had taken 8 years to uncover 11 pages, and now she was losing 3 weeks. Then she said the words that made the old woman tighten her hold. She said she had 8 weeks left before she turned 27. Rocco sat outside in the hallway on a plastic chair all night and never came in. At dawn, when someone opened the door to replace the water pitcher, he stood, remained at the threshold for exactly 3 seconds, and said 2 words, "My sister." Then he left. At 7 that morning, Salvatore's men returned from Bywater. There were 3 metal safes and 1 wooden cabinet in the workshop, all of them holding paper. The wooden cabinet in the front room was untouched. The first and third safes held her business records, and both were intact. The fire had started less than 3 feet in front of the second safe, the one against the north wall, the only one of the 4 cabinets that contained the files she had brought there on Monday. Salvatore listened to everything, then went into her room and repeated it to Delphine exactly as he had promised, without leaving out a single word. She lay still for a long time. Then she said that the 3 safes were identical, the same make and the same color, and anyone who hadn't been shown which one to choose would have had to open all 3. On her second night in the hospital, Delphine asked Odette to bring her the tin box from home and place it beneath her pillow. Inside the box were the burned notebook and the flat-tipped tweezers. She set the box on the meal table over her bed, opened it, and stared at it for a long time with both hands bandaged halfway to her elbows. Then she called Salvatore. "Sit down here. Come closer. What do you need?" "I need 2 hands." "I don't have any." He sat down. She glanced toward the tweezers. "Hold them in your right hand. 3 fingers, not 4. Hold them the way you'd hold a pencil, but don't rest your hand on the table." He picked them up. His hand was far too large for the tweezers, and in 33 years that hand had done many things, but it had never done this. She guided him through it 1 small step at a time, her voice dry and even, as though she were reading aloud from a procedure. "Put the tip of the tweezers into the upper left edge, where the light looks slightly different. Don't press. Just touch it and hold. Now wait. Don't do anything. Wait 8 seconds. The warmth from your hand will soften that spot a little. Now ease it upward. Half a grain of rice, no more. If you hear a tiny sound, like paper tearing, stop at once and move back." They worked that way from 9 that night until nearly 2 in the morning. 4 times he made a mistake, and all 4 times she began the instructions again, without the slightest sharpness in her voice. On the 5th attempt, the 12th layer separated from the 13th and curled upward, and at her direction, he moved it onto the sheet of glass beside them. She leaned forward to read. The upper half of the page was almost blank. Only 4 lines of writing remained, in her mother's small, slanted hand. The first 3 lines were a shopping list. The 4th was a sequence of 11 digits. Delphine stared at the number and said nothing for nearly a minute. Then she spoke, and her voice had changed. "For 8 years I thought it was a telephone number." "It isn't? Telephone numbers here have 10 digits. This has 11. She studied it longer. The first 3 digits are a year. The next 4 are a collection code. The final 4 are the item number within that collection." She looked up, and all the color had left her face. "This is a Historical Society archive number. My mother wrote down a file number." Then she spoke faster, like someone sliding toward a place she had known was waiting for her all along. She said her mother had worked as an archivist for 21 years. She said people in that profession didn't take important things home, because homes burned, homes were entered, homes had other people living in them. An archive had temperature control, registers, and 9,000 boxes. And something placed in the wrong location, there was something no one would find for 30 years. Then she said the final words very slowly. She didn't hide it. She entered it into the archive under the wrong number. 3 days later, June Hathaway arrived with a search warrant and a representative from the Historical Society. The number in the catalog led to a collection of 18th century river route maps. Box 14, Shelf 9, in the East Room. The room the fire hadn't reached 8 years earlier, though water from the firefighters had flooded one corner. Inside the box, wedged between 2 volumes of maps, was a cloth-bound ledger. It hadn't burned. It had been soaked, and 8 years inside a sealed box had fused its pages into a solid block. All 3 people standing there saw at once that no one on earth could open it except the woman before them, with both hands still wrapped in bandages. They took it back according to proper procedure, documenting everything and photographing every step. And Delphine waited another 11 days until the bandages could be removed. Then she sat at the table in the West Room, with its 4 north-facing windows, and worked for 4 straight days, 14 hours a day, with Salvatore sitting across from her, holding the lamp, and Hathaway at the head of the table, recording every page. The ledger contained 46 pages. The first 30 were numbers, arranged by month and written by hand, 1 sum on each line, with the reference number of a document beside every entry. They showed that assets had begun flowing out of her daughter's trust before Josephine died, and they showed that money from the charitable hospital fund had traveled along the same route. Then came 3 letters, handwritten copies of 3 letters she had received. They had dates but no signatures, and all 3 said the same thing in 3 different forms of polite language, that if she continued demanding an audit, she would bring harm upon her own daughter. The last letter was dated exactly 19 days before September 12th. Page 46 held only one short passage, written more hurriedly than anything that came before it. She wrote that she had placed the audit provision in the trust because she didn't believe she would still be there, and that she had written this archive number in the notebook so that if anything happened, her daughter would be the only person in the city who understood what the 11 digits meant. On the final line, she wrote to her child, "If you are reading this, then I made a mistake somewhere. You did nothing. You did nothing, Delphine." The next day, Hathaway brought another sheet of paper. It had taken her 5 weeks to obtain it from the forensic department's archive. It was the blood test result for an 18-year-old girl whose blood had been drawn on the night of September 12th, 8 years earlier. In the official record read by the court, that section stated that nothing of significance had been detected. In the original report from the forensic laboratory, it stated that a powerful sedative had been detected at a high concentration, and it clearly noted that the substance wasn't something that could have entered a person's blood by chance. Delphine read the 2 sheets of paper lying side by side. Then she set them down on the table, and for 8 years, she had never done this in front of anyone, not even before her own reflection in the 4 mirrors of the east hallway. But in that moment she covered her face with both hands and wept. This time there was no silk ribbon, no press, and no one applauding. The call came from a private secretary, and the meeting place was an upstairs room in an old restaurant on Sharp Street, the kind of room reserved for dinners that never appeared in the ledger. Whitlock arrived first, alone and without a briefcase. There was nothing on the table but water. He invited Salvatore to sit, poured him a glass, and began by saying he had heard about the fire in Bywater and was deeply sorry. Then he said that was precisely what he wanted to discuss with him that day. He said he had been thinking about the matter for weeks, that he was a father and understood his daughter's condition better than anyone. He said there had been a fire 8 years ago, and now there had been another, in her own workshop, at the very moment she was reopening the old case files, and that when the same thing happened twice around the same person, outsiders would draw their own conclusions, whether he wanted them to or not. He said it with the expression of a man enduring something heartbreaking. Salvatore sat in silence. In the locked drawer at home, he had 46 pages that had been separated and pressed between sheets of glass, 3 dated letters, a blood test preserved by the forensic laboratory itself, and a report from a New Orleans Police Department detective recording the exact date and time it had been removed from the archive. The man sitting across from him knew none of that. It was the first time in 4 months that Salvatore knew more than Beauregard Whitlock, and he kept his face perfectly still. Whitlock placed one hand on the table and came to the heart of the matter. He said what needed to be done was very simple. A written statement, prepared by a lawyer and signed in Salvatore's name, saying that during the time they had lived together, he had observed signs of instability in his wife, that she had a habit of working alone at night, with lamps and chemical solutions, and that he couldn't rule out the possibility that the Bywater fire had begun there. That was all. He didn't need to say she was guilty. He only needed to say he couldn't rule it out. Whitlock said he would handle the rest, that a doctor had already been found, a place had already been prepared, and that she would be cared for in an environment better than anywhere she had ever lived. Then he named the price. The Eastern Cargo Terminal loan would be erased, not delayed, not refinanced, but erased. 400 people at the terminal would still report to work on Monday. He added that because Salvatore was her lawful husband, he would allow him to retain complete control over the assets held in her name, without conditions, as compensation for having to make such a difficult decision. He said all of it in the same warm, measured voice he had used when speaking about people who entered his hospital with nothing in their hands. Salvatore didn't answer at once. He sat there for 90 seconds, and during those 90 seconds, the man he had once been awakened inside him and began to calculate. That man had led this family since the age of 29, after a morning in a church parking lot, and he had learned that the most valuable thing on any table wasn't what was right, but what could purchase the most with a single payment. That man counted. 400 homes, 400 rents, 400 installment payments, children in school whom he had never met and would never meet. A statement that didn't say she was guilty, only that he couldn't rule it out. That man also reminded him that he wasn't a judge, that the evidence in the locked drawer could still be submitted, that she would still be exonerated by the evidence, and that the statement would eventually become only one sheet of paper among hundreds. That man laid it out neatly and reasonably, and for those 90 seconds, Salvatore truly weighed it. Then he thought of 2 hands bandaged halfway to the elbows, unable to hold a pair of tweezers, and the way her voice had sounded when she said 3 weeks meant 3 weeks. He thought of the words on page 46, "You did nothing," written by a woman who knew she might not be there much longer. And he thought about how Whitlock had just asked him to write down the exact words that had placed her inside 4 walls 8 years earlier, to write them again in the hand of the only person in the world now, sleeping beneath the same roof as she was. He lifted his glass, took a sip of water, and set it down. He said this was a serious matter, that the statement would follow his name for the rest of his life, and that he needed to put a few things in order at home before he signed it. He asked for 3 days. Whitlock leaned back and smiled, the smile of a man who had just heard exactly the answer he had been waiting for. He said 3 days was reasonable, that a cautious man was always more trustworthy than one who decided too quickly. Then, after Salvatore had risen, he added one last thing. He told him not to think too much, because in the end, everyone chose the larger portion. Salvatore came home at 10 that night and didn't sleep. He didn't use those 3 days to decide whether he should accept, because that had been settled during the 90 seconds on Chartres Street. Whitlock simply didn't know it. Salvatore used those days to make certain his answer could never be erased. He took the first step on Saturday morning. He summoned the lawyer from Baton Rouge, and before a notary public he had never met, he gave a sworn declaration, 4 pages long. It contained the date, the time, the address of the room on Chartres Street, and the names of the man who issued the invitation and the man who attended. It contained every part of the offer, written in the exact order in which it had been spoken. A statement declaring that his wife was unstable, a sentence saying he couldn't rule out the possibility that the Bywater fire had begun with her, a place already prepared to which she could be taken, all in exchange for the erasure of the Eastern Cargo Terminal loan and complete control over the assets held in her name. On the final page was a single sentence, stating that he rejected the entire offer without negotiation and that he fully understood the financial consequences his refusal would bring upon his family. He signed it. The notary stamped it and retained 1 copy. The lawyer took another back to Baton Rouge, and a third was sent to an attorney's post office box in Houston, with instructions that it be opened only at the request of a court. He did this because he knew that a sheet of paper kept in a locked drawer at home could burn as easily as anything that had burned in Bywater. The second step took 2 days, and it cost far more. The Eastern Cargo Terminal was pledged as collateral to Whitlock Merchants Bank, so he couldn't sell it, give it away, or remove it from Whitlock's grasp by any means except one. He had to pay the debt in full. He didn't have that amount of money available. What he had were other things. On Sunday afternoon, he called Perpetua and Rocco into the study and explained it plainly. He said he was going to mortgage the house. He said he would also pledge the cold storage facility and his entire ownership interest in the chain of laundries, and that he would borrow enough from another bank to pay Whitlock in full that week. He made it clear that he wouldn't take a single dollar from the family trust, that if the plan failed, whatever was lost would come from his own share, and that if his grandmother wanted to keep the house, she only had to say so and he would find another, slower way. Rocco asked how much slower. Salvatore said 4 months. Rocco said she had 8 weeks left. Then Perpetua placed her hand on the desk and said she had lived in that house for 51 years and had watched her husband mortgage it twice, both times for reasons that weren't worth what this was worth. She told him to sign. On Tuesday, the Eastern Cargo Terminal loan was paid in full. Whitlock Merchants Bank received every dollar on time, and not one provision remained that allowed it to touch the 400 names on the terminal payroll. The leverage broke, and it broke on the very day Salvatore was scheduled to sign Whitlock's statement. On Tuesday evening, he went upstairs to the West Room. Delphine was sitting before the 46 pages pressed between glass, the bandages removed from her hands and only a thin layer of gauze still wrapped around 3 fingers. He told her everything. He told her about the room on Chartres Street, repeated every part of the offer in the exact words her father had used, named the price, and told her that he had asked for 3 days. Then he told her the part he didn't have to tell. He said that in that room, for 90 seconds, he had truly weighed the offer. He said he had counted 400 homes, had thought that the statement would be only 1 page among hundreds, and had told himself that the evidence would still prove her innocence. He said he wasn't proud of those 90 seconds, and he would never deny that they had happened. Delphine sat in silence. Then she asked why he was telling her. "Because I don't want to build anything with you on a lie," he said. "Not even a lie that makes me look like a good man." She studied him for a long time. Then she asked what had ended those 90 seconds. He said he had thought of her 2 hands unable to hold a pair of tweezers, and of how he was being asked to write in his own hand the very words that had put her inside 4 walls 8 years earlier. Then he added one more thing, and it was the last thing he said that night. "My grandmother told me she knew what those hands were made to do. It took me 10 weeks to understand what she meant." On Wednesday morning, Whitlock's secretary called twice. Salvatore accepted neither call. He merely sent a man to the building on Poydras Street carrying an envelope that contained a copy of the document confirming that the Eastern Cargo Terminal loan had been paid in full. There wasn't a single word enclosed with it. The appointment at the federal prosecutor's office was set for 9 o'clock Friday morning, and the cardboard box containing all the evidence would be carried there by the husband and wife themselves, together with Detective June Hathaway. 3 people knew the time. 3 people knew the route, because the route had been finalized in the study on Thursday afternoon, while Harlan Voss sat there with his leather notebook, writing down that they would leave at 8:20 and that the car would take Magazine Street before turning onto Poydras Street. Salvatore allowed him to write it down. He did so because he needed to know for certain, and there was only one thing he had miscalculated. He thought what would come was a car blocking the road and several men demanding the box. At 8:20 on Friday morning, Amos Thibodeau drove through the gate. He was alone. Removing Delphine's gauze took longer than expected, so she and Salvatore left 15 minutes later in a second car, while Amos went ahead with an empty cardboard box on the back seat, exactly as Salvatore had arranged, because the real box had been in Hathaway's possession since the previous evening. At an intersection with a traffic light on Magazine Street, a small truck without license plates shot out from the right. Amos turned the wheel. He didn't turn right. He turned left, and the car spun exactly halfway around to take the impact on the driver's side. When people reached him, both his hands were still on the steering wheel, and the wheel was still turned toward him. The funeral was held Monday afternoon in a small church in Bridgeport, and it was brief because Amos Thibodeau had no one in the world except the Orsini family. People filled 6 rows of pews, most of them dock workers from the Eastern Cargo Terminal. Men Amos had driven through the gates for 40 years. Perpetua sat in the front row and didn't cry. She only held her hat in her lap. Delphine sat beside Rocco. Salvatore said nothing during the service. At the end, when they were preparing to carry the casket out, he walked forward and placed the car key on its lid. Then he stood there for about 5 seconds and spoke so quietly that only the 3 people nearest him could hear. 400 homes, old friend. Outside the church, Rocco stopped on the steps. He didn't look at his brother. The old man wrote the time in his notebook. I sat 3 feet away from him and poured his water. You made me do that, and I did it. I know. Then tonight I'm going to find him. No. Rocco turned around. Mr. Amos drove our father. He drove me to school when I was 7 years old. You're telling me no? I'm telling you no. Father wouldn't have said that. Father lay dead in a church parking lot 4 years before you thought of the words you just said. Salvatore turned toward his brother, and he didn't raise his voice. He hadn't raised it once in those 4 months. Listen to me once. Tomorrow morning, those 46 pages go onto a federal prosecutor's desk. If anything happens to Harlan Voss tonight, then tomorrow no one in that room will read those 46 pages. They'll read a different story. They'll read that the Orsini boss dealt with one of his own men before that man had a chance to testify. Rocco stood motionless. And there is one more thing. Salvatore spoke more slowly. If we do that, they'll be right about us. This entire city has been talking about us for 20 years, and they'll be right, and she will forever be the wife of a man like that." Rocco stared down at the steps for a long time. Then he asked what Voss would have to pay. Salvatore said he would lose his profession, his license, and the reputation he had spent 40 years building, and that he would sit in a room and confess to everything in exchange for having a few years taken from his sentence, because he was the kind of man who kept copies of everything he had ever done, not out of conscience, but as insurance. He said that insurance would be what killed him. Then he said one final thing, that as for the truck without license plates, Rocco's task wasn't to find it. His task was to give the police the access card those men had used to enter the terminal gate on Saturday night the month before, because the two incidents were one and the same. That night, Rocco went nowhere. He sat on the front steps of the house until after 2 a.m, and Delphine brought him a coat, then went back inside without saying anything. At 8 the next morning, the three of them drove through the gate together, and this time, no one went ahead. The conference room was on the 9th floor, with one long table, 11 chairs, no audience, and no reporters. On one side of the table sat the federal prosecutor and 2 members of her staff, Detective June Hathaway, Salvatore, and Delphine. On the other side sat Beauregard Whitlock with his private attorney, and at the far end of the table, 3 chairs away, sat DeWitt Parrish and Harland Voss, each with an attorney of his own. All 4 were there because they had been subpoenaed, not invited. Whitlock greeted his daughter with a slight inclination of his head, and for the first 4 hours he maintained the expression of a grieving father. Delphine gave the presentation. She didn't use a projector. She had the 32 copied pages of the investigation file, the 46 pages from her mother's ledger that had been separated and pressed between glass, and her own handheld magnifying glass. She spoke from her chair without standing, and she identified exactly 3 details in the report that no one had examined closely in 8 years. The first was the signature on the final page. She placed the magnifying glass over it and invited the prosecutor to look for herself. The signature of the investigator in charge had been written over a section of paper, where another signature had been erased and replaced, and the fresh ink crossed older strokes that remained faintly visible beneath it. She said the person who had originally signed the report wasn't the person whose signature appeared there in the end. The second detail was the case number in the upper right corner of all 32 pages. The final 4 digits had been written over 4 different digits, and when examined from an angle, the original strokes could still be seen. She read the 4 original digits aloud. The third detail was the page numbering. The report was numbered continuously, but in the evidence inventory, the content on page 14 didn't connect to the content on page 18, and the table of contents at the beginning of the file still contained a line naming those 3 missing pages. She said those 3 pages were the statement taken at the police station on the night of September 12th, and she said she knew exactly what the second of those pages contained, because she had spoken those words twice to a detective sitting on her right at 4 o'clock in the morning. Hathaway confirmed that she was the person who had written them down. Delphine then produced the workshop's supply records for 3 years, and the original blood test obtained from the forensic archive, placed them beside the corresponding entries in the official case file, and allowed the 2 sheets of paper to say everything else. DeWitt Parrish broke first, and he broke faster than Salvatore had imagined possible. When the prosecutor produced the records for his lake house, and 4 transfers made into 2 accounts belonging to his sons during that same period, he sat motionless for about half a minute, then said he wanted to speak privately with his attorney. 20 minutes later, he returned and testified that the 3 pages containing Delphine's statement had been removed before the file was closed, that he hadn't removed them, and that the person who gave him the altered report to sign again was an attorney he had met only twice. Then Harland Voss spoke. He didn't break. He requested an agreement before opening his mouth. And when he was told the greatest degree of leniency the prosecutor could consider, he opened his briefcase and removed a thick, hardbound file he had brought with him at the beginning of the meeting. It contained copies of everything he had prepared for Beauregard Whitlock over 19 years, including the 4-page draft inserted into the prenuptial agreement, and the correspondence concerning the payment classified as private work on September 19th, 8 years earlier. He hadn't kept those documents out of conscience, he said so plainly. In his profession, the person who didn't keep copies was the person who would be made to bear everything. The prosecutor made it clear at the table, loudly enough for the entire room to hear, that any agreement granting leniency would apply only to financial fraud and falsification of documents. As for what had happened on Magazine Street on Friday morning, he would still face prosecution as a defendant, and the access card used at the Eastern Cargo Terminal, which police had received 3 days earlier, had led them to the owner of the truck without license plates. Voss sat back down and said nothing more. Then came Odette LeBlanc. She described entering Delphine's room on the wedding night. She described the newly healed places where the dress had rubbed her skin open, the kind of dressing that couldn't have adhesive along its edges, and she said that in 40 years of service in that house, she had never seen anyone sit so straight without shedding a single tear. She added that she herself had taken down the 4 mirrors in the east hallway, and that Miss Delphine had ordered her to hang all 4 of them back in their original places. Near 4 in the afternoon, Delphine closed the case holding the glass plates and said she had one final question. She addressed it directly to the man sitting across from her, and she spoke very slowly. She said the 3rd letter, copied into her mother's ledger, was dated 19 days before the night of September 12th, and that in the letter, the writer had said that if her mother continued demanding an audit, she would bring harm upon her own daughter. Delphine asked how many times he had said those words to her mother before putting them in writing. Whitlock's attorney immediately placed a hand over his and said, clearly and urgently, that he mustn't answer. Whitlock answered anyway. He said her mother had been warned enough times that if she had agreed to stop, nothing would have happened to anyone, and that she had chosen what happened. The entire room went silent. The court reporter stopped typing. The prosecutor asked him to repeat what he had said, and he repeated it, adding this time that he didn't regret trying to save this very daughter from her own mother. Those 2 sentences contained both things they needed. He had known in advance, and he had chosen to let it happen. He and DeWitt Parrish were arrested that same afternoon. When they passed Delphine, Whitlock didn't look at her. She didn't rise. She remained in her chair with both hands resting on the case of glass plates, and she felt nothing resembling victory. She felt only something level and quiet, like a sheet of paper finally lying in its proper place after 8 years. 6 weeks later, the court vacated the conviction from 8 years earlier. The proceeding lasted 12 minutes, and no one came to watch. In the records office, the clerk entered the new information and asked her to spell her name again. Delphine stood before the glass window and said it aloud, 1 letter at a time, without needing anyone to prompt her. Delphine Rousseau. For 8 years, she had never spoken her own name to a stranger, because for 8 years, that name had always been read aloud by someone else before she could say it herself. At the police station, in court, in the newspapers, and it had always come attached to something. The clerk finished typing, stamped the document, and said, "That's all, ma'am." When they returned home that afternoon, Salvatore handed her a packet of papers. The assets her mother had left were now fully transferred following the audit. The accounts had been placed in Delphine's name, and he told her that from that day forward, there wasn't a single provision left in the world that allowed anyone to make decisions for her. Then he said the harder part. He said their marriage had begun with a letter calling in a loan and an offer about which no one had ever asked her opinion, that now she had money, her name, and her freedom, and that she had the right to leave whenever she chose, even that day. He wouldn't stop her, and he would never bring it up again. Delphine held the packet without opening it and asked him one question. "Do you want me to stay?" The man who had spent his entire life never allowing anyone to read him gave her an honest answer. "I do." Then he continued, speaking slowly. "But what I want isn't as important as what you choose." She stayed. She told him that for 8 years, everything in her life had been decided by other people. Where she slept, what name they called her, even the story of what had happened to her own mother, and that this was the first time she had ever been allowed to choose anything. She said she chose this. Their second wedding was held in the backyard on a November afternoon, without a grand hall, without 300 guests, and without anyone coming merely to watch. Perpetua sat in the front row. Odette stood beside her. Rocco was there, and June Hathaway arrived 10 minutes late because she had just finished an interview. One chair in the outer row was left empty, and a car key rested on its seat. This time Delphine wore no gloves, and the vows they spoke were words they had chosen themselves, not words someone else had purchased for them. The following spring, she opened a conservation studio on the ground floor of a building on Magazine Street, funded by the money her mother had left her, and without taking a single cent from anyone else. It accepted only one kind of work: documents from cases in which people claimed the evidence had burned, faded, disappeared, or been altered. During its first 2 years, the studio restored files for 19 people, and 4 of them received new trials. A small bronze plaque hung on the door, bearing only one name, Josephine Rousseau. It was smaller than every other bronze plaque in the city, and it said more than all of them combined. One April afternoon, Delphine sat on the porch with an open notebook resting on her lap. She wasn't wearing gloves. Her 2 hands lay bare in the light, uncovered and unhidden, and it no longer occurred to her that she should conceal them. Salvatore came outside and sat beside her, then placed his hand over both of hers. Not to hold her there, not to close his fingers around them, but simply because that was where he wanted his hand to be. The story of Delphine and Salvatore leaves us with something very simple: that the worth of a human being doesn't lie in their face, nor in the judgment someone else writes about them, but in what they continue doing when the whole world has stopped believing them. It also reminds us that true kindness isn't rescuing someone and then keeping that person for ourselves. It is returning to them the right to choose their own life. And it tells us that the truth can remain buried for 8 years, 20 years, or even longer. But if one person remains patient enough to separate every layer of paper and read what lies beneath, then eventually the truth will find its way home. If tonight's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that each day we can listen to more meaningful stories together. We would truly like to know how you feel about Delphine and Salvatore, and if you have ever witnessed someone being judged unfairly, please leave a comment so we can listen to what lies deepest in your heart. Thank you for staying with us until the final words. We wish you and your family lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next story.